address some questions, and I've brought some books along because one of the questions we're going to touch on briefly is the world of Oceania. And I was chatting with Anne last night, where did this term come from? Who said the Pacific is called Oceania? Because it's still used, and especially in scientific circles, I think still. But in popular language, I've travelled to most of the islands and atolls of the North, South, East and West Pacific, and I've never heard anybody in the Pacific refer to oh, you Oceanian, you, welcome. And so it does raise an interesting question, and so I just out of my own library, I just bought some books, Oceania, and so on and so forth. So it's just a thought piece on the world of Oceania and what does that mean for us, and who's doing the naming. Because from an anthropological point of view, the one who's doing the naming is making a claim to the proprietary, the ownership, the home. And usually it's outsiders who use other names. So we'll do our best not to say Oceania too often. We might end up with a confused identity. All right? Okay. And we want to discuss some questions on whakapapa and relationships, and the ancestors who explored the world, and a few other questions, and then I'll have some questions to ask of Anne, and in this way we'll have this what Socrates refers to as a dialogue of questions and answers. And I come from Whangape in the North Hokianga, and I come from a school of thought which says, if you're not sure about what you're talking about, make it up, do look sincere. So in Whangape we put a lot of emphasis on sincerity. Now if you're really smart and you see my sincerity rise, you know it must be shitting. Or I'm making it up and looking sincere. So measure whatever I say by the sincerity. Okay, is that all right? Okay. That means we should get on well for the next half hour.
It's working?
Okay.
Working? Oh, yeah. So we thought that we would address the issues of scene setting together, because that seemed like the right thing to do. In talking about voyaging in the old world, voyaging in the new world, voyaging into the future. And I had the privilege, it was interesting because my interest in this whole area of voyaging began with trying to understand the very first encounters between Māori and Europeans, and that took me to look at Tasman and then Cook and then other explorers like Marion Dufresne and so on. And then it extended out into the Pacific to Tahiti. So I spent quite a bit of time in Tahiti as well. And in the course of that exploration of voyaging, it was the thing that was so extraordinary about it was trying to understand what was happening on the beaches and inside the kāinga and inside the pā when the first Europeans arrived in different parts of Aotearoa, but also in places like Tahiti. And in the course of doing that, I met up with some of the great voyagers. So I had the privilege of meeting Herb Kane, who helped to set up the Polynesian Voyaging Society and build the Hokulea very early on when I was thinking about what happened in Kealakekua Bay with the death of Cook, and met up with Herb. He grew up in the bay next door, and wandering around that bay with him, and we were reconstructing what had happened as we were in the landscape. The story seemed to just come out of the land and out of the ocean. We were looking at the actual place where the priest's house stood, where the priest had their pools and so on. And it was an extraordinary experience wandering for a couple of days around that bay with Herb. And then I met, fortuitously, Mo Piolug, who trained Jack and Hotu and many others. Met him in Hawaii as well, actually. and was invited to go and see him, and he was about to set off to Yap. He was about to cross from Hawaii, the big island, all the way over to Micronesia with quite a young crew. And what an extraordinary guy. He was just so... The main anxiety he had was the escort yacht. They made him have an escort yacht, and it had problems with his motor, and he was missing his good wind because of the problems with the escort yacht. And then after that, got to know Metsuhek, Jack, Hoturoa, who I've known since, because his dad and I were colleagues in Māori studies for a long, long time, and got to know Hotu when he was quite young. And the thing that has impressed me about all of those voyages, and this is something I want to ask Manuka about, because I think you'll understand it more deeply than I do, but it's something that really struck me from the time I talked to Herb, to the meeting with Mo, then talking since with other people who've sailed with voyagers or who are voyagers themselves. And then reading all the literature on Polynesian voyaging and so on. The literature is quite technical. When you talk with the voyagers, they end up telling you things that happened, in which their ancestors appeared and amazing things happened. And that's from talking first with Herb, but listening to Jack and listening to Hotu talk about the voyages and the power of the ancestors in that way of navigating. It's not just about the stars. And so, Manuka, I'd like to just ask you to tell us a bit about this oceanic world. We won't call it Oceania, but Wananuiākiwa, Hinamoana, that world of the ancestors and the role of whakapapa in it, and the relationships that sort of shape that world and keep it so dynamic even right into the present and into the future. So could you talk to us a bit about that, the role of whakapapa in that world and just how it works?
Thank you. Good, Annie. Well, I'm interested in the question, and whose name do we give to the Pacific? And I remember Manuka Henare, Sir James Henare, often referred to, always talked about Hawaii, then he talked about Kiwa. Te Wananuiākiwa is the Polynesian name. So after that, I spent a lot of my life as an academic trying to trace who was Kiwa. And on one trip to Japan, where I was exploring this, Kiwa is a big ancestor in Japan. And I was able to find that for many of the Southeast Asian countries, they seem to have the name Kiwa in their languages. What that began to tell me is a lot of where Māori came from originally, and that has to be Southeast Asia. And all the linguistic, all the latest archaeological work and all that kind of thing is now affirming what the oral traditions have been saying for a long, long time. Te Wananuiākiwa. And because the name Pacificus in Latin, and on their very early maps out of Europe, you will find Pacificus in Latin and the Pacific. That's not an internal name. It's a name given by an observer, I think Portuguese, who upon seeing the great ocean and how calm it was, just called it this great sea of peace, Pacifica, Pacificus in Latin. So, and so we've inherited that name, and it's an apt description of this great ocean. And just years later, I was studying Coleridge's great poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And if you like Coleridge, as I do, then you may remember he bemoaned the fact that he was becalmed for long, long periods in the Pacific Ocean. And that's what he complained about. And no wind, no tides, and no things like this. And so he wrote, that was the basis of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You may remember the famous expression, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And that's a pickle, to be stuck in the Pacific and nothing to drink. So I can understand his problem. The only thing that I would add is some the references that Sir James used to often give to Hawaii. He always referred to Hawaii as two places interacting. There's the Hawaii of the spiritual world. There's the Hawaii of the material world. And he often, in his talk, would refer to both. And he was to instruct a lot of us young ones then to always refer to Hawaii, and behind the word Hawaii is a whole history that points to why Māori are here, why Samoans are here, and why what we call Polynesians are here.
So one of the things that I learned when I was working in Tahiti was that the old name of Raiatea it refers to Hawaii. So when I was trying to understand the role of tupaia in the voyage and going to Taputapuatea, so I got very involved with people who were fighting to have Taputapuatea recognised as a World Heritage Site. And there is this proposition that perhaps the network of voyaging sites, which include here, but also include, for example, Tūranganui a Kiwa, with that name again, that name of Kiwa yet again, that they may also be linked and recognised as testimony to one of the great feats of human history, which was the exploration of this vast ocean, a third of the Earth's surface, by the ancestors of Māori. And when I was trying to understand Tupaia's role in the voyage, because it's clear that in those days the navigators were high priests. You know, Tupaia he was trained at Taputapuatea as an arioi tahua. So he was a high priest, and he was a member of the arioi society. And the arioi were dancers, they were actors, they did these satirical skits, they were musicians, they were artists and tattooists, and they were also voyagers and priests, and their ancestor Atua was Oro, who was the god of fertility and war, both death and life. And so when you're saying that about Hawaii being the realm of the ancestors on the one hand and a place on the earth on the other, in Te Ao Marama, it looks as though the navigators in those days spanned those two worlds and linked them. So with Tupaia, so the arioi used to go on these voyages, I learnt from the people in Tahiti, and from the old manuscripts, they would carry their atua from island to island in their waka, these amazing waka they had. Absolutely, they were different from the one that's sailing here from Whaiti. It's different from that. They had these big platforms on them, and they were beautifully carved, and they would go on these great voyages from island to island, and they would land en masse, and there would be huge celebrations when they arrived, and they would help run the seasonal rituals. So the thing that I started to begin to understand at that time, and I still don't really get it in a way, but that when we read the contemporary scientific literature about voyaging, most of it misses the element that was about spanning those two worlds and linking them so that you could get from A to B in this vast ocean with the help of your ancestors. And often you were carrying them from one place to another. And I started to hear about places called Taputapuatea here in Aotearoa when I was doing that work. And there are various places with that name here as well as in Hawaii. So how do you think this world that you're talking about, and the way Sir James described it, with the world of the ancestors and the Hawaii in that world, and the world of Te Ao Marama and Hawaii in this world, how did the ancestors of Māori use these forces and these powers to traverse the greatest ocean on earth and eventually find their way down here?
Well, what I do, what I am aware or do know, is that you have to talk to the natural world and the world of the ancestors. And the natural world, meaning the oceans, will tell you what to do. The clouds will tell you what to do and when to do these things. This is good navigating. But then you also talk to the ancestors who will tell you and guide you in what to do. And the talk of the ancestors is always do the mahitika. What you do has to be correct. Because if you're in Māori thought, Polynesian thought, you're either tika or he. We don't do grey. You're either right or wrong. I don't think there's a Polynesian word for grey. So you don't sit in the middle and procrastinate. It leads to cultures, and especially this sort of navigating this great ocean, where decisiveness is an attribute of a leader. And one makes a decision to say, we'll sail this way. If upon sailing that way you realise you're not heading in the right direction, you just change course and change, no big deal. And now with that insight, I began to marvel at the ancestors who could sail from Hawaii, probably have to sail 3,000 to 5,000 kilometres to find these islands they later called Aotearoa. And what marvellous navigators they had to be, reading the natural world, reading the world of the divine, and reading the human world all at once.
So when I was working with these navigators and people at Taputapuatea, and being at Taputapuatea, that marae in Tahiti, which was the great voyaging marae in that era as well as today, and realising the power of what used to happen there, and still does. It still acts as a kind of magnet for voyaging people, and I guess Jack and Hotu and all the others, they've all been there. People are still going back to Taputapuatea and voyaging. And so I remember that when Tupaia joined the Endeavour, there'd been a big war. The warriors from Bora Bora had come and attacked Raiatea, and Tupaia was put in charge of the young high chief, high chief of that island, and he had the gods with him, Oro, and he had the red feather girdle, that was the insignia, and he sailed with this young man to Tahiti itself, because to keep him safe, to keep the descent line safe. And when he got there, eventually forged a relationship with Pūrea, who was the high chieftainess of one of the districts, and they decided to try and set up her son as the high chief of the whole island, and it didn't work. And so when the Endeavour turned up, Tupaia was fascinated by the, you can see why, I guess, if he was a star navigator, they'd come to observe the transit of Venus. So they were all about looking at the stars, and then they had the artists on board, and the arioi were artists, and Tupaia started sketching with them, I think, because there are all these sketches that he did that are so beautiful. And then I think he decided, well, he would go with them, because I think he was curious and probably apparently wanted to go to England and get guns to try and get rid of the people the warriors from Bora Bora off his own home island. But the amazing thing is that they'd sailed around the island in the longboat together, Tupaia with Cook and Banks and some others. And when Cook set sail from Matavai, Tupaia was actually piloting the ship. And I really it's so interesting that Cook was prepared to allow that to happen, because for a captain, a Royal Naval captain at that time, to more or less give over the control of his vessel to somebody else was a huge thing. And to do that in this way was really... So Tupaia stood there and he started calling up the winds. And he was chanting to get a wind to take them to Huehine. And a wind did arise. And Banks writes quite scathingly in his diary about it, his journal about that. But the wind did arise. It was a good wind, and it took them to Huehine safely. And every time they landed an island, Tupaia took them to the marae, and they went through the rituals that the arioi. So they went through the proper processes, and then they ended up at Taputapuatea with the Endeavour. And when we went there, you have to go through the Avo Moa, which is the sacred pass. And Cook must have been wrong-headed, because he headed into the wrong pass originally, and Tupaia managed to get that sorted, more or less with the locals. But of course the border people were there. So you could sort of see that already Tupaia was turning it into an arioi voyage. And from the point of view of the people in the Society Islands, must have seemed as though Tupaia somehow had commandeered this kind of remarkable, weird vessel with this very strange, they call them all sorts of things, tupua and in Māori, goblins and these very, very, very odd crew of his, and was taking them on this voyage. So, he called up the winds. He tried to get Cook to sail off to the west because he'd been to Tonga before. Tupaia had been to a lot of places. And how can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, I'm sure Jack and Hotu will talk about this too, but the way in which the winds and the stars and the whales like Paikea, they're all ancestors.
Yes, well, one attempt to answer that question, I came in contact with elders of the Nuaean community all living in Potoni, and got to know them well, and I used to go and have conversations with them about navigation, and how did they find their way around the Pacific. And I met a lovely old gentleman, and his job was to lie on the bottom of the canoe and listen to the waves. He says it was like listening to the sonic booms. So a wave would hit an island, and the wave would bounce back across the Pacific, and that's how they could find islands, one way. Now, how scientific can you be? So what we're discussing here, Anne, is two scientific methods, two quite distinct scientific methods, and yet both working in the Pacific. Although Cook, for all of his methods, he still had to have a Polynesian navigator just in case, and because he was not in the natural world for him. As a Navy officer, I've been re-looking at his life again, and basically I need to overcome some problems I've had with Cook. But I've begun to admire him as a Navy officer and a highly skilled sailor and a great navigator. And because I marvelled at how do you bring a boat from England all the way around the world into the Pacific and then start sailing the Pacific. Because I was trying to think, I can't think of a Polynesian who sailed their first canoe from here to England and came back. So I just marvelled at this and then began to see him in a new light. But it's this clash of two, not a clash, the interacting and encounter of the mind, two sciences trying to understand how to navigate the world.
Actually, I love that. Two sciences trying to understand how to navigate the world, and in a way, that's our challenge, isn't it?
Today, yeah.
Still today and into the future. Here in Aotearoa, two sciences, two ways of living, two ways of understanding reality. And in that case, I guess they were out there in the ocean, and Cook had never been there before, of course. And as you say, it wasn't his world. Wasn't his world. So he was on an unfamiliar ocean. And in a way, the debates that people are having around the way we've understood our history in the past, where they say Cook discovered New Zealand. Well, yes, he discovered it for Europe, but of course it had been traversed for generations and generations and millennia by the ancestors of Māori. And the thing that amazed me as I delved into the stories about Tupaia and sort of looked at the other navigators who helped Europeans in the early years in not just in Tahiti but also in the Tuamotus. The Spaniards were coming across from Peru, and they also picked up island navigators to help them find their way through. I've got brothers who sailed. 4 of my brothers sailed together. My mum always used to get absolutely terrified having 4 of her sons out there in the Pacific. And they talk about what it's like, even with GPS. You have GPS, and if you were following your GPS, you'd be sailing a kilometre inland in some places in the Pacific. There's all these rocky coral outcrops and things that aren't marked on the charts. And so Tupaia would have been familiar. I know when they went through the pass on the reef, I think it was at Huahine, and he sent someone to dive down to figure out how deep the draft of the Endeavour was, so he could tell Cook whether it was safe to take the ship in or not, and that kind of thing. And the fact that they came south, because Tupaia wanted them to go west because he'd already been to Tonga and he wanted to go back there, I think. And he didn't win that. He didn't win that struggle. But as they were sailing south, he and Cook and Banks and Pickersgill, it looks like, Lieutenant Pickersgill, and also the ship's master, they started working on this chart. And Tupaia's chart, which shows the knowledge that he had of the Pacific at that time, of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, or Hina Moana, or as we would call it probably here, just so extensive. It was a huge sweep of the ocean. And it didn't actually at that stage include Aotearoa. But the next time that Europeans sailed after Omai had sailed in the second voyage, when the navigators went back to Tahiti, there was reference then to two islands, Pounamu and Teatea, they called them, which I'm sure were Mai had told them about these islands, and they'd gone into the island lists back home. So they seem to have this system of capturing in the Arioi and the navigation schools, because they had these schools, and Mo and Jack's, and I know and Hotu have been through the school with Mo, but the schools on Tahiti, they were obviously, every time someone found a new place, it wasn't written down, but it went into these island lists. And Aotearoa came onto the lists back home as soon as someone successfully got back home to tell everybody else what they'd found. So what can you tell us about the ancestral stories of the first ancestors that came here? And, I'm not talking about Cookie, I'm talking about Kupe and the others.
Well, I think I don't have much to add other than what you've described, but other than the names Kupe Kuramaruatini, his partner and wife, and all the other explorers. One of the things we don't know is how many missed finding the islands and therefore perished. All we know are the arrival stories. We don't know the actual human cost of those who left Hawaii or East Polynesia or wherever, and missed the Chatham Islands or missed these islands. And my one sense tells me there must have been high casualties because they were sailing a great ocean that no other humans had yet attempted to do. The other thing I just want to quickly mention is some work on, there was a significant technological development in Taiwan and what enabled humans to sail oceans as the size of the Pacific, and that's the invention of the outrigger. And it's the outrigger turning their canoes basically into a type of catamaran because they had whole communities on it. And when you think of the majesty of that invention and the entrepreneurial behaviour that the new technology leads to, it's worthy of thinking about the catamaran. The other area that I was interested in, we know a lot about the tailing of the Pacific and heading south to the South Pacific, but I did, because I had two PhD students who informed me, they were looking at the sweet potato, the kumara, and they gladly informed me, happily informed me, that the kumara is not a Māori word, a Polynesian word, and neither did it come from the Pacific. It came from the high Andes in Titicaca, in the lake area up on the top of the Andes, and you had to go Peru, Chile, then further up in the Alps. Oh, and so that was something of a shock, but anyway, so trying to be a good academic, I did follow what my students had done. So I did a trip to Titicaca, and we were to genetically trace the kumara from a specific place in the Andes on the side of this huge inland lake, Titicaca. And the kumara is an Inca word. And so you have we know a lot about the Polynesians that came south, but we know very little about the Polynesians who were still exploring from the Easter Island over to Chile, to Peru, down towards the bottom of the Latin America. They explored all their coastlines. And maybe that's an area in which many of us now want to interest about our ancestors who sailed the whole of the Pacific, not just a one-way highway to Aotearoa. And what they discovered in those early navigations, some of that food finally made its way to Aotearoa on other adventures. So one gets a sense that while other land-based big continents, land masses, had a fear of the oceans, the small island populations were not fearful of the islands. They knew the oceans. They knew that the oceans were getting from A to B. It was over the water that you did your discoveries. That is what led to innovation in navigation, innovation in canoe design, and so on and so forth. Humans adapting to their environment in quite remarkable ways and seeing the world as they knew it. And ours was a watery ocean world.
Well, that idea of the oceanic, the great vast oceanic world, and the people like Epeli Hauofa, when he wrote about our Sea of Islands, and pointed out that, for those ancestors and for people in the Pacific today, that the ocean is a home. It's not this vast, empty, scary expanse. It's a place that has its sea paths, it has its star paths, it has its familiar creatures that pop up in particular places. And when I was talking to a colleague of mine who sailed for about 20 years with one of the last surviving Polynesian navigators, Kawea, and she said that when she sailed with Kawea from Taumoko, it was one of the atolls to the far, far west expanse of Polynesia, that Rata in Māori stories is the great story about how the first canoe was built. But their Rata is their atua of the whole island. And Kawea was the high chief of the island, and he was also a star navigator that she worked with for 20 years and sailed with. She's a sailor. And the interesting thing is that she's a very skilled sailor and somebody that understands contemporary yacht design and all that stuff. Hydrodynamics and wind dynamics on sails and all those things. But she said that as she got into sailing more and more with Kawea, she said that when he sailed on his own canoe, he became Lata. He became that ancestor. And the waka was, the belly of the sail was the belly of Lata. And the canoe was his body. And she said sailing like that, she's only started writing about this because she knew that if she wrote in the scientific literature about her experiences, that people would probably think she was crazy and start dismissing her as a scholar. But she has started writing about it. And so the thing that really strikes me is, when you think about Tahiti, and I spent a lot of time in Tahiti, and it's gorgeously, nearly always warm. And sitting in that tent last night when it was so freezing, and I was thinking about, Hotu and Jack, and, you think of the ancestor from Tahiti, they would have been wearing bark cloth probably. I mean, they did no puffer jackets or anything. And what was it that impelled them to keep sailing south? The weather, I know it was sort of, the time was probably October, November, and it wasn't probably quite as cold as it can be, but gee, it can be cold in these latitudes at that time of year. And what was it that just impelled them to keep sailing? What was it that inspired them to, even then when it started getting really freezing cold, to come down, to come here, or to come up here, I suppose, in those days? Yeah.
One possible answer to that question, what inspired people to sail, my understanding is that in Tahiti and Samoa and many other places of the Pacific, the humans were to observe the kuaka and the toroa. The kuaka would say be flying from Siberia and fly right round through the Pacific, eventually making its way to Aotearoa. And then they would spot the same birds flying back in another circular fashion, another way. The toroa was the great super deluxe bird that could glide for 20 or 30 miles, I believe, and then do the new sweep and catch the new waves. And that's how it was able to sail the Pacific, the toroa, the Royal Albatross. And Māori got to know these two birds, as did other Polynesians. And so they followed the birds. They followed the trail of the birds, knowing that if those birds went that way, they must have landed somewhere. And all they had to do was keep going and they'd strike land. And my belief is that's how Kupe found Aotearoa, by just confidence in the natural world. Because he could still see, and his wife Kuramarutini could still see the birds. And so there had to be trees, there had to be food, and so on and so forth. And they just kept sailing until they found whatever islands, islands of interest to them. I think the other area of interest is because we know the linguistic story, know the oral traditions, but another area that I was interested in was in the area of genetics. So I did what every good anthropologist did. I had my DNA done. And my father is Scot, my mother is Māori, and she was the one that came up in my genetic information, and then I was told that's typical. The female Y chromosome is the one that doesn't mutate as much as other things. I think that's the wording goes. And so they were able to trace her to southern China and give me all the data, and I worked with the geneticists in Melbourne and other parts of the world, and they were covering all this sort of thing. And I said, what about my father? Yes, a bit wishy-washy was the best word they could have, and the Scottish thing was a bit vague, so I said, well, I can forget him because I know where he came from, but I was interested in, and so the genetic trail actually followed the linguistic trail, and logically that makes sense. If linguistics takes you back Taiwan into Southeast Asia, then so there's the combination. The other one was we went looking for the word Mauri, M-A-U-R-I, because some Hindu scholars and some Muslim scholars and said those words are in Hindi, are in the Sanskrit. And so we were able to follow them and a group of Māori elders that we ended up at the start of the Ganges rivers at the base of the Himalayas. And there we found the Hindi word Modi. And that just opened up a whole new area of inquiry.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the clock, and when I had my DNA done, Lisa, probably here somewhere, and they told me that I had an ancestor who was a red-haired Neanderthal woman. And when I told Jeremy that, he said, well, that explains a lot. Anyway, we've got so many tohunga and experts in voyaging to speak to us, and it's going to be wonderful to hear from them. So I think Manuka and I better step down to make sure that the real tohunga of this art have time to speak. Nā reira, e aku rangatira, yeah, tēnā koutou, yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions. You know how things work here. Our speaker, Ara, who wasn't, is not too well, so it's just carried on, and so it was great to carry on with this session. But we've got 5 minutes before morning tea, so if your question's going to be longer than morning tea, please try and cut it down.
I just wanted to know, who are the atua that our ancestors believed in?
Take your time, I'll give us time to think of something. So this is what I'm going to say. You look at my level of sincerity, whether you want to believe it or not. Yeah. So the question was?
Yeah.
Who are the
Who are the
Atua?
Who are the Atua?
Who are the Atua? Well, religion, because that's how I see a lot of Polynesian society, because we're religious cultures. And develop their religions in terms of their life experiences, that's one, but also in terms of their knowledge through being human inquiry about the nature of the world they're living in. And so, their Atua world was a real world. It was the world of the divine. It's the world in which the material world comes from. And all genealogies that I've come across throughout the Pacific, particularly in Māori, if you follow the whakapapa, you will inevitably arrive at Io Matua Kore, or one of the many names of Io. And now Io tradition has gone through a lot of bad press, and one of the things that was the reason for my PhD, to test the evidence that it was oral tradition of great value or made up fictions. And I couldn't find any evidence other than it's a tradition of oral traditions of the Pacific. And
Yeah. So I wouldn't have the temerity to try and answer that particular question, except to say that when Tupai arrived, you know, one of the things to think about when the Endeavour arrived was that it was Tupai who could talk to people. And Tupai was he was a tahua from, a black leg arioi from Taputapu Atea and Ra'i Atea, Hawaii. And so the locals must have, it must have been like another ancestral arrival coming back from the homeland. And we do know that there was not much time for conversation in Turanganuiakiwa because everything went wrong there and there were shootings and no time to talk. But when they got up to Uawa and then they had whakatātere o te rangi and the local ariki sort of took command of the whole session, and Tupaia spent a lot of time talking with the tohunga from Te Rāwhioro, from the School of Learning there. And Wayne Ngata and I've sometimes speculated if only one could be in that cave, when they were sitting up there above the bay and talking about, because they did talk about their atua. Tupaia was asking them about their atua, and I'm sure he was telling them about what had happened back at Raiatea since they'd left and all that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think we have to rethink that whole encounter. We've only talked about Cook mainly in the past. Tupaia almost didn't feature. But from the Māori point of view, it's pretty clear, because when the Adventure came back on the second voyage and went back to Uawa, people came out and they were weeping and they were calling for Tupaia. And when they heard that he died, they composed a waiata for him. So I think from the Māori point of view, and you can see exactly why. If you've got a high priest from Raiatea on board the ship, yeah, I mean, that must have been incredible. And talking about, those are the conversations between Tupaia and the locals that none of us have access to, really. Well, maybe some do. Yeah, the stories have been passed down. Yeah.
I'll just quickly discuss method. There's two ways of looking at genealogies from within the Taipukura tradition. You whakaheke to, or you whakapapa to. So you whakaheke. So you start from the top and you can make your way back to he tangata. Or you start with he tangata and you go through the layers, whakapapa tu. And I just find that a form of science. You start off with the divine, you come back to the humans, you look at the human stories and you work back, and that's the way I think there's a method there that is worth further investigation and inquiry. Whakaheke and whakapapa.
Pass the parcel.
Kia ora tātou. For a mass of people to leave their islands, taking risks and coming over the Pacific, was there, and they were so papakapu, was there a reason for them leaving, or were they simply discovering?
Here you go. Yeah.
All I can comment on in the Te Aupōuri traditions, in our oral traditions, some of the explanations that I've picked up from those oral conversations was Hawaii and places like that were overpopulated and people had to move. That's actually been a lot of the story of the Pacific. And that all got overpopulated. Some could stay and some had to move on. And so, and that's one of the stories. And we don't linger on that enough. Why did they depart? It wasn't for a holiday. They were forced by necessity. And whānau and the hapu chose who to stay and who would go. And there was a matter of survival. Otherwise people died. Because that's what there's some Te Aupōuri stories that talk like that. I've asked in other parts of the country about it and had various responses. One along the lines that I just given from the Te Aupōuri story, and others trying to still working that out.
But at the same time, you know, Manuka, you said there were two sciences involved here, and I think there were. I think of the kaumātua I've known well too. You know, the people like Edward Sterling, who was, you know, my mentor, and they had this. I can think of so many. Sir James, you know, they had this intellectual curiosity and this sense of wonder and kind of wanting to understand and spending a whole lifetime learning. And I reckon some of those voyages would have just been like, you know, scientific voyages, scientific exploration, what's out there. And why else do people now get on these waka, you know? Why else do people now get on there? Because they're trying to say, our ancestors could do this and we can too. And it's a wonderful ocean out there, and it's, these days people are saying it's dying, you know, the things that are happening to our sea. And who knows better about that than the voyagers, the people that are right there on the water, seeing what's going on in our ocean. So I guess one of the other hopes is that spirit of curiosity and wonder, but also of wanting to take care of, you know, doing our best to make sure the ocean can be restored to health somehow, that can be part of the legacy of what happens in the next year or so. Because the oceans, you know, they used to call it in Tahiti a marae. Call the ocean a marae, a place where you go to be healed. And if you harm the place that heals you, you know, I think we're doing some really stupid things in the world at the moment. And I think the voyages, one of the reasons I'm so thrilled to have Hoturoa and Jack and others guiding us on this journey is I think the star navigators are the people who can see over the horizon. They'll help our country find a new way, I think, maybe. If we have faith in them and support them.
Yes, I've already referred to the inquiry. And I also talked that there was, my second part was, there was overpopulation, people were forced to move, and that's a human story, it's global. But there was the inquiry, and we know that the fact that they just followed the birds and kept following them until they hit an island, that's an inquiry. The birds go that way and they've got to rest and eat up. And I think there was that investigation side of it. But you see, that's a different style of navigating.
But if you're Ngāti, you pick a whale to follow. It's bigger, paikea, you know. I mean, those whales also migrated and they're big. So the story of paikea.
The natural world was what sparked a human inquiry, following fish, following birds, watching the clouds, watching the waves, who the wave is a solid system. A wave hits the bank and then bounces back, and they knew how to read the waves. And you know, I gave you that example of the Nuan, that a gentleman I knew, and he could lie on the bottom of his canoe and listen to the ocean, and he knew what to do. That art, at the time, he was bemoaning the fact the young Nuans in New Zealand were no longer interested in putting in the hours of lying in the bottom of a canoe to get the old methods. And unfortunately, a lot of it may well have been lost by Nuan.
And I think that's a good note in which we take a break.